Wagwan. Good morning, good night. Welcome back. And if you're listening for the first time, welcome to episode 2 of The Real Situation, where we give you a taste of Jamaican politics. I'm your host, Melanie Byfield. And I'm joining you following a couple of weeks where Oli Pagwan. Not getting caught up in all of the isms and schisms, so we're just going to reason about the real situation of where Jamaica is on this journey to becoming a republic. So first off, the report of the Constitutional Reform Committee was submitted to the government and tabled in Parliament without the signature of the members of the committee who were from the PNP opposition party. So let's look at who the CRC is in any event. We have Marlene Malahoo Fort, KC, King's Counsel. She's the chairman. There's Rocky Mead. He is co-chair from the Office of the Prime Minister. Derek McCoy, KC. Senator Donna Scott Motley. Anthony Hilton, who's an MP. And Hugh Small, KC. Those three are the PNP ministers who did not sign the CRC report. There's also Thomas Tavares Finson, KC. He is president of the Senate and commissioner of the Electoral Commission of Jamaica. Senator Ransford Braham, KC. Dr. Lloyd Barnett, he is a national constitutional law expert. Professor Richard Albert. Now, Richard Albert is an international constitutional law expert who is Canadian. He's not Jamaican, he's Canadian. Dr. David Henry, he is from he's a representative of the faith-based community. Dr. Nadine Spence, she's a social and political commentator. Mrs. Lalita Davis Mattis, she is a member of the National Council on Reparations. Sujay Boswell, he's an advisor on youth strategic engagement. And Dr. Elaine McCarthy, who is the chairperson of the Jamaica Umbrella Group of Churches. All heap of liars, right? So that's been a criticism of the makeup of this committee. And also the fact that not one of these representatives is on behalf of the Jamaican diaspora, who is somewhere between 2 and 3 million people. So, the leader of the PNP, Mark Goldin, held a press conference where he talked about why the PNP objected to and would not sign the final report, which is primarily based on Jamaica's final court of appeal. Those and other objections to the report were outlined in a document, and they included matters such as immunity of a president, selection of an interim president, the removal of a president, impeachment of parliamentarians, life of Parliament, composition of the Senate, dual citizenship, but of course the big one is the Caribbean Court of Justice. I'd urge you to read the report. I've attached it as a link to this podcast, but I'm going to briefly just talk about some sections of it, right? So, one thing the report does, first of all, is it talks about how the committee engaged and educated the public about this whole process. And it does state in the report that, and I quote, the public education and engagement exercises should be expanded. I totally agree. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how this report shows how there was an insufficient public education campaign. So only 2 publications were made in the 2 major newspapers, the Gleaner and the Observer. As we know, there's 14 parishes in Jamaica, right? And a town hall was only held in 5 of those. There's approximately 180 high schools in Jamaica, and only 4 high schools were directly engaged, which is obviously very important because those 17 and 18-year-olds in high school are going to be the ones who will be potentially voting in the referendum. So yes, the public education and engagement exercises, expansion of those is a must. On the subject of public education, I actually came across an excellent show by the wonderful Dion Jackson Miller, fabulous reporter, on her show All Angles. It was aired on May 24, and it's called A Breakdown of the Constitutional Reform. Really informative. Check it out if you can check it out. I accessed it on onespotmedia.com. But, as I say, very informative. So, continuing. Section 3.1 of the report is the Jamaicanization of the Constitution. And here the report says that the CRC is firmly of the view that after 6 decades of sovereignty, it is no longer acceptable that Jamaica's constitution, although drafted in Jamaica and debated in the Jamaican Parliament, should be contained in a schedule to the British Imperial Instrument, the Jamaica, in parentheses, Constitution Order in Council 1962, which was made in Buckingham Palace on July 27, 1962. So, the CRC is recommending that Jamaica's constitution should be repealed and replaced with an instrument made by Parliament and approved by the people of Jamaica. Right? Moving on to section 4.1, which is the removal of the British monarch as head of state. The report says it is no longer considered appropriate for Jamaica's form of government to be a constitutional monarchy where our sovereign is the King of England. Jamaica's head of state should not be a hereditary monarch, but instead one chosen by a process in a representative democracy which affirms Jamaica's sovereignty. So the CRC now is recommending, on that basis, that the British monarchy be removed as the head of state, number 1. Number 2, that the British monarch should be removed from the legislative and executive authority of the state. That a new head of state for the Republic of Jamaica be established, and further recommends that the removal of the British monarch, recommends the removal of the British monarch as part of the Parliament. So here's where the sticking point is, right? Because those actions alone don't fully decolonize Jamaica. And this is where the argument about the Caribbean Court of Justice comes in. Because it's argued here that there should be an additional further recommendation, which should read something to the effect of, and the removal of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council as Jamaica's final court of appeal, and establishing the Caribbean Court of Justice in its place, which would then remove Jamaica's legislature, executive, and judiciary from colonial control. Jamaica is actually one of 12 countries who established the CCJ. It's served by its original jurisdiction, right? So Jamaica can bring cases to the Caribbean Court of Justice, and they interpret the international law based on the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, which was what established CARICOM. But it doesn't serve Jamaica with regards to the appellate division. Right now, only Barbados, Belize, Dominica, Guyana, and St. Lucia are served by that court's appellate jurisdiction. That's why the reference is only made to Jamaica becoming a part, the Caribbean Court of Justice being Jamaica's final court of appeal. Jamaica's already a member of the court, right? One of the two arms of the court. Section 4.1.4, the head of state is being recommended by the CRC in the form of the office of a president of the Republic of Jamaica. They're recommending that this president have ceremonial functions with certain executive powers, which do not involve any administration of the government, and that this person should basically hold the same powers as the Governor General holds now and has an initial term of 7 years. Moving on to Section 12 is where the Caribbean Court of Justice is referenced. The report basically states that since the political parties don't agree, and if there isn't going to be any consensus on that matter, then the issue should be placed before the public and put on the referendum ballot. Speaking of the Privy Council, they recently proposed and withdrew what is called a review of merit rule, which was frowned upon big time by JAMBAR, Jamaican Bar Association, which they called a violation of the Constitution and a deprivation of litigants' rights. So traditionally what happens is an appeal that goes to the Privy Council is heard before a panel of 5 judges or more as a right. This new rule would have seen appeals being reviewed by a single judge who could then determine whether the appeal has merit. So it got a whole heap of backlash. I am going to refer to a Jamaica Observer article on May 24, where the Peter Champagne KC basically says, and I quote, "It is an even clearer indication that Jamaica needs to decide on a future without the UK-based court." So, where we're there. Bad news, we have a flat tire. The government has no position on Jamaica's final court of appeal, and the opposition are saying they're not moving forward without full decolonisation, which is Jamaica leaving the Privy Council and establishing the Caribbean Court of Justice as the final court of appeal. Right? Good news. We can keep educating ourselves, because ultimately, where there's a will, there is always a way. And as the government now is set on this new public education campaign, so they can explain to the public about the CRC's recommendations, what we're hoping is that somebody's going to get out the car, roll up their sleeves, and fix that flat tire. And that way we can carry on this journey to what should surely be full decolonisation. So speaking of colonisation, let's talk about how Jamaica became colonised by the British in the first place. What is it that started this need for independence, right? So, the arrival of the British. Before we look at that, we got to jump back a little bit to the 1500s, because Jamaica was originally colonised by Spain, who basically wiped out the Arawak Indians, who were occupied the island, and forced them into slavery. They killed them off through either execution, death, overwork, malnutrition. Some committed suicide rather than become slaves. So fast forward to the 1600s, and the British defeated the Spanish, officially taking possession of Jamaica under the Treaty of Madrid in 1670. And their main source of income was piracy. So there were pirates like the infamous Welshman Henry Morgan. They would attack Spanish ships, carry out mainland raids, steal gold and silver, collect their rewards from the king, and bring all of them teeth to Port Royal, because that was their headquarters, right? So Port Royal became a very, very rich city. But on the same note, Port Royal was overrun with pirates, prostitutes, all heap of liquor, and known as the wickedest city in the world. We are become by this instance We are become by this an instance of God Almighty's severe justice. That was a declaration by a member of the Jamaican Council after Port Royal. 2/3 of Port Royal dropped in the sea in 1692, following an earthquake that was so terrible, it was thought to be divine intervention for what was going on in Port Royal. Right? Thousands of people died. And when it dropped in the sea, when those 2/3 of Port Royal dropped in the sea, and actually took the cemetery where the body of that pirate Henry Morgan was, pirate later turned plantation and slave owner, and his body was never located. So that pretty much ended piracy. So the main source of income for the British would now be replaced by sugar. So fast forward to the 17 and 1800s, Jamaica was now going to become the largest exporter of sugar in the British Empire. In Britain, sugar had become this symbol of prosperity, right? Real high status, a luxury good. And it was also very labour intensive. So the British decided to use forced labour, more specifically slavery. So what they did is they raided African villages, captured millions of Africans, and enslaved them to work on those sugar plantations. Jamaica was the most profitable of Britain's plantation economies, right? 80% of Britain's foreign income came from this triangular route. The ports in Liverpool, London, and Bristol were booming from slavery, from the slave trade. So by around the 1740s, there was about 430 sugar plantations in Jamaica, and the plantation owners were well rich, right? They bought property in Britain, they invested in British firms, sent their children away to boarding schools in Britain. Some of the richest people in the British Empire, their generational wealth, was a result of their fortunes that they got from slavery and sugar plantations. So we're going to briefly talk about three who were considered to be the richest plantation slave owners, right? Simon Taylor. He was a politician, millionaire, owned thousands of slaves and hundreds of acres of sugar plantations. Same story for Peter Beckford. His wealth actually funded the political careers of his children in Britain. And then we have an ex-brethren, Charles Ellis. Again, politician, millionaire, owned thousands of slaves and hundreds of acres of sugar plantations, considered to be in the top 1% of those wealthy plantation owners. He actually sat in the UK Commons, where he was a prominent defender of slavery. So we just talked about the benefits of the sugar industry for the British, right? So now let's talk about what the sugar industry meant for the African, who by the 1800s, the numbers had increased to more than 300,000. Now, that triangular route I mentioned just now, here's how that worked. Africans were captured during raids on villages. They were then transported to the West Indies, and then slave-grown products like sugar, tobacco, and cotton were taken to Britain. This middle passage, which was also known as the Atlantic Passage, was well brutal. It was overcrowded. The conditions were unsanitary. Hundreds of Africans were packed tight below deck on a voyage that was going to last for anywhere from a few weeks to several months. And the conditions on the plantations were just as horrendous. Families were separated. The housing conditions were abysmal. Beatings and torture were rampant, and a lot of slaves died from overwork and starvation. No country excels Jamaica in a barbarous treatment of slaves or in the cruel methods they put them to death. That's a quote from a book by an author called Charles Leslie. The book's called A New and Exact History of Jamaica. Basically, slaves were terrorized into obedience, right? The harshest punishment was given for the most minor incidents, and the punishments were sickening, right? They were flogged, whipped to the point of almost loss of life, dismemberment, gang rape, branding on the forehead. And there were some real cruel punishments. There was a thing called Darby's dose, where one slave was forced to shite in the mouth of another, and then they were gagged to force them to swallow. And then another part of Darby's dose was called pickling, where a slave was basically whipped until their wounds were open, and then they were placed in a vat of salt and banana pepper. Yeah, so slaves had no rights. It wasn't a crime to kill a slave, and there's also the fact that politicians, lawyers, and judges were slave owners, so they took absolutely no interest in prosecuting mistreatment of slaves. But resistance to slavery in Jamaica was a daily occurrence, right? Rebellions started as early as the 1690s. There was a particular rebellion actually in 1690, and for that rebellion the leaders were executed. And whoever escaped joined the Maroons in the mountains. Who were the Maroons? The Maroons were slaves who, when the Spanish were defeated by the British, they freed some slaves, and those who managed to escape took off to the mountains and formed their own independent communities. Following a couple of wars with the British, the Maroons actually signed a treaty, and as part of that treaty they agreed to support the British against any foreign invasion, and that they would also help capturing rebel slaves or runaways and return them to their slave owners. The most significant and largest slave rebellion in the whole of the British West Indies was a revolt called Tacky's Revolt. That was 1760, 1761. It was larger. It was only second to the Haitian Revolution, right? It was so large. Tacky was joined by about 1,500 slaves who killed as many as 60 white people and destroyed thousands of pounds of property. The lieutenant governor at the time, who was accompanied by Maroons, actually dispatched a militia who defeated Tacky and his followers. And even though Tacky's revolt only lasted about a week, it's real famous. And basically all the other rebellions, there was a series of battles that happened after that, and they were all linked to Tacky's name, even though they were carried out by other leaders such as Apongo and Simon. And these rebellions went on for about 18 months. Until they were finally suppressed. What was the punishment for those rebellions? They would face execution, hanging. Some were burnt to death or starved to death. So, there was a factor that, look, rather than be captured, I'm going to commit suicide, because a lot of slaves didn't want to face that type of punishment by being captured. But smaller groups did continue with a kind of guerrilla warfare on plantations. So meanwhile, while slaves are rebelling in Jamaica, there was an abolition campaign that started in Britain around 1780. And you had activists like Thomas Clarkson, William Wilberforce, and Joseph Sturge, who would travel the country and collect accounts of abuses against slaves. They would demonstrate techniques that were being used to restrain slaves and give public lectures, even speaking in the House of Commons in their attempt to have slavery abolished. They were very dedicated, right? And their dedication saw what would first off be the passing of the Slave Trade Abolition Act, which didn't actually abolish slavery itself, but it abolished the trade of slaves. But obviously things couldn't stop there, right? But the one thing is that by the time that act was passed, more than 2 million slaves had been traded to Jamaica, and thousands had died during that Middle Passage journey between Africa and the Caribbean. The cursed blast of slavery has, like a pestilence, withered almost every moral bloom. Those are the words of another famous abolitionist, William Knibb. He was an English Baptist minister and a missionary. And he travelled to Jamaica in 1824, and he was so repulsed by what he saw, the conditions that slaves were held in, the treatment of slaves, that he stayed in Jamaica because he felt he had to fight the injustices that he was seeing. He was a big problem for plantation owners because of his anti-slavery rhetoric, right? So he was attacked. His life was threatened. He basically had to, go into hiding because they wanted to force him out of Jamaica. He stayed until around 1832, where he left for his own safety. But when he went back to Britain, he carried on the public campaign, right? Now having first-hand knowledge of the horrors and the harsh realities of how slaves were being treated in Jamaica. And he actually gave evidence in Parliament of this as well. We're actually going to jump back a year, though, to 1831. And, yeah, slavery still hadn't ended, but there was a Baptist minister called Samuel Sharp who had a plan. He was going to put an end to slavery. And to do this, he was going to have a non-violent strike on December 28, where slaves would refuse to work until wages had been negotiated. He had great support for the plan, right? But on December 27, some slaves set fire to buildings on the Kensington estate in St. James. And then all hell broke loose. Violence broke out on other plantations, and in retaliation, the government sent in armed forces and ended up killing over 500 slaves. What happened to Sam Sharp? He was tried and hanged for his role in instigating the revolt. But here's the thing. Even though so many lives were lost, this revolt had a tremendous impact. It's known as the Christmas Rebellion or the Baptist War. And it basically led to the British government having to abolish slavery. Destruction of property, it was about £500,000 of property that got destroyed. But again, it forced them to realize how much slavery was hated, right? Sam Sharp, as we know, is a national hero of Jamaica. He was given Jamaica's highest honour, the Order of National Hero, in 1975. So the abolitionists were keeping up the pressure, right? You had people like Thomas Burchell, who was a Baptist ministry. He travelled Britain, giving information about the atrocities of slavery to the public. There was another guy called Edward Jordan. He had a newspaper called The Watchman, and he was getting support from the free mixed race class, and he ultimately helped to implement the articles of the act that would abolish slavery. So what was that act? The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, right? That came into effect August 1 of 1834. So what led to the passage of the act? A few things. Britain's economy was unstable. They'd lost the monopoly on sugar, now having to operate in free trade. And they couldn't compete with, the likes of Brazil and Cuba, who had larger plantation economies. There was the persistent struggle of the African. The plantations owners were in fear of slave uprisings. And then there was the constant pressure also of the abolitionists in Britain. So, what did the Act do for slave owners? Well, it contained a provision, and it basically paid slave owners for the loss of their property to persuade them to allow the bill to be passed. Right? A government consensus of 1834 shows that about 40,000 awards were made to slave owners. This represented about 40% of the British Treasury's annual spending budget. So by nowadays numbers, the British government paid slave owners in the region of 16.5 billion for the slaves they would be losing. Right? Some of those payments were made in government annuities, 3.5%, right? And in 2015, that's correct, 2015, the government decided to redeem all the remaining undated bonds. So in 2015, the descendants of slave owners were still benefiting from those payments made by the government for lost slaves. So what did the Act do for slaves? Okay, so the 1834 Act only gradually abolished slavery in most British colonies. And you were only free as a slave if you were under the age of 6. Now, above that age, a slave would receive what was known as an apprentice status, right? That means that you were required to work for another 6 years because there had to be a transition to freedom, right? So this apprenticeship system had ex-slaves working for their former owners until 1840. And they had to work for 40 hours, in exchange for which they would get lodging, food, clothing. They had the option to hire themselves out for additional wages in the remaining hours of the week. And then with this money, an ex-slave could then buy their freedom. Colonial slavery died 31 July 1838, aged 276. That was a sign that Nib placed on a coffin that he buried with chains and shackles, and it marked the end of that apprenticeship system. It was due to run until 1840, but because the plantation owners were committing so much abuses, it was actually ended 2 years early. So, effective August 1, 1838, slavery was abolished in all British colonies, and slaves were awarded full freedom. But we're not done yet. We have more time to spend on our history as we travel down this road to becoming a republic, truly independent and sovereign together, and remembering someone needs to fix that flat tire that we got right now. I'd like to leave you with a quote by the right to excellent Marcus Garvey. You at this time can only be destroyed by yourselves, from within and not from without. You have reached the point where the victory is to be won from within and can only be lost from within. You can find this podcast on Buzzsprout, Spotify, Podcast Index, Deezer, Podcast Addict, Apple, iHeartRadio, and Amazon Music. And if you want to reason about anything else in between that, you can email me on atasteofja@outlook.com. Until the next time, I thank you for supporting this podcast, and I thank you for taking the time to listen. One love.